What makes a great photograph? In this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about what makes a great photograph, whether you're looking for a great photo to use or whether you're taking or making a great photo. What are some of the elements that are really important to making sure that your photograph is great? We'll begin by talking about some of the technical factors. There are many technical factors that can contribute to whether or not a photograph is a great photo or a poor photo. Some of those technical factors include things like exposure, focus, sharpness, depth of field, color, accuracy of skin tones, color temperature, and noise. We're going to go through each of those in a little bit more detail, but the first point I want to make is that there are technical factors that what makes a good photo and what makes a photo that isn't so good. The first factor has to do with exposure. The word exposure really is all about light. How much light is used to make a photograph? And we've all heard the term underexposed or overexposed. And I think you probably have a pretty good idea what that means. Here's an example if we look at this picture where we're taking a picture of a subject and the bright light behind the subject causes the subject to go a little bit dark on us. Our subject here, the important part of the photograph, in this case is underexposed. So here we have an underexposed photograph. Now, sometimes you can fix these underexposed photographs by going into Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop. Sometimes you can't, depends on how the picture was taken and how much leverage you have with the photograph. But exposure is very important. On the flip side of being underexposed is being overexposed. Sometimes you have too much light making the photograph, and as a result, the picture becomes kind of washed out. It fades into the light. Now, one thing I want to mention here is when I talk about technical factors, I may talk about something and say, well, that's something you want to avoid. It's underexposed or overexposed. The one important thing to realize, though, is that sometimes it's okay to break the rules. So while I'm explaining to you some of the kind of rules of photography, having a proper exposure as an example, there are cases where you might want an overexposed photograph or you might want an underexposed photograph. An example might be a silhouette. So let's say you're at the beach, the sun's going down, and you want to create a silhouette of someone. Intentionally underexposing that photograph and placing a bright light source behind them, you get a really cool silhouette effect. So keep in mind that while I'm giving you some guidelines here of what makes a great photograph, some things will work despite breaking rules or despite not kind of meeting some of the technical requirements. Focus. Focus is a really, really important one because if a picture is out of focus, 9 times out of 10, that's not going to be a photo you're going to want to use. Now, there are cases where you want to use a soft focus or you want to do other things, but if you can't determine what the subject is because the picture is so out of focus, you probably don't want to use that photograph. And I've seen this time and time again. I've working with the web, I've had people send me photographs that they wanted to use for a website, and they were strongly out of focus. Those really aren't going to leave the right impression. A photograph typically should be in focus. Sharpness is another factor. Sharpness, much like focus. With sharpness, though, what you'll find is that the picture becomes kind of soft. While much of it may be in focus, you may end up with areas that aren't as sharp or crisp as they could be. And sharpness is a technical factor. A sharp picture sometimes is more appealing. Now, when you're taking photographs of people, sometimes a little bit of softness is good. Sometimes we don't want to highlight the sharpness of the lines in our face. And that's something, again, that you can work with editing. But when you're looking for quality photographs, if the photograph strikes you as not looking sharp or not looking crisp and you think it should, then I would let that influence your decision of whether or not to use that photograph. Depth of field is another technical factor. Depth of field is an interesting one because when we take a photograph, we want our subject to be in focus. In this case, we have a ladybug here. The ladybug is nice and sharply in focus, but if you look in the background, it all just kind of fades into kind of a pool of colors. And that's really a result of a very shallow depth of field. This photograph was taken with a lens that supports a very shallow depth of field, meaning that one area can be in focus and the background can kind of go softly out of focus. Now, that can be a very desirable effect when you're taking portraits or you want to isolate a subject. That shallow depth of field can really help you accomplish that. In fact, you can look at how shallow the depth of field here is on this photograph. As you may notice that the front and bottom of the branch there are actually slightly out of focus. The ladybug there was in the depth of field while the branch began to move out of the depth of field. So, at any rate, depth of field is a technical factor. It's something to consider when you're looking at a photograph. You might find that if you have 3 similar photographs of a person standing in front of the docks, let's say, that if you use a shallower depth of field, you might find that the background and the docks go slightly out of focus, and it makes your subject sometimes look a little bit more more in focus and a little bit more depth to the photograph. So sometimes that's a desirable effect. That's depth of field. Color is important. Color is important for a lot of different reasons. Color accuracy can be important. Vibrant colors can be important because they can be really eye-catching. You've got to be careful with color because in some cases you may want to highlight certain colors and bring them out, but you've got to watch what that can do to other colors as well, and we'll talk about that in a moment as it relates to skin tones. But color is an interesting criteria. Color vibrancy can really kind of draw readers in when it's on a report. You may even search for images by color, so you might want to look for images that kind of pull out certain colors. So color is a technical factor that's important to consider when looking for great photographs. Along with colors, skin tones, the accuracy of skin tones is really important. So while you might, look at, photographs that are really vibrant in color, if they really overdo the skin tones, that can look very unnatural, and that can be a negative, reflection of the photograph. So looking for accurate skin tones can be really important, especially when you're shooting people. Another one is white balance, and here we have somebody, and it looks like the color is off. Well, in fact, this is an issue with white balance, and you may know who that is there. In this case, I made this example just to show what can happen here. But what happens is light has color. And when you're taking photographs, your camera has a really smart meter, which helps to measure what we call the white balance. That white balance helps to measure the color of light and then reflect it accurately in your photograph. However, under certain conditions, you'll find that meter becomes full, and it can't accurately reflect the color. As a result, you might end up with people looking blue or looking orange or looking green. Well, when you're selecting a photograph, you probably don't want to use one where somebody looks blue. We used to joke in photography class that it's okay to warm up skin tones a little bit, make them a little bit more vibrant, but people generally don't make their friends blue, and if they do, they don't usually stay friends very long. Blue is not a good color for people. So at any rate, the technical factor here is white balance. When you see someone is off color, green or blue or orange, that's often not a color problem, but just a color of light issue with the white balance. If you're taking the photograph, you can often correct it. If it's a photograph that you find, you may have a little bit more trouble correcting that. Another factor is noise. Cameras today have gotten really good at taking pictures in low light situations. They do that through what's called a very high ISO. And ISO gives the camera ability to shoot in very low light situations and still get a pretty good photograph. One of the byproducts of using a high ISO is that it generates heat. And that generation of heat can result in noise on your digital sensor. Noise looks very much like grain does if you remember looking at pictures that were shot on film. You get kind of a grainy quality to them. When you have a lot of noise in a photograph, it can get kind of a very grainy quality to it as well. And at a certain point, it can really kind of ruin a photograph. Now, again, not all things that are bad are always bad. Sometimes people will intentionally introduce noise into a photograph or shoot at high ISO to get that intentional noise. That can work extremely well if you're converting a picture to black and white and you want to give it kind of a gritty old feel. So keep in mind, while I talk about some of these things being negative, in most contexts you don't want to use a noisy photo if you've got an option that's clear. In some cases it might be perfectly acceptable and something you might want to consider. So those are some of the technical factors that make great photographs. So technical factors, number one, something to consider when you're looking for great photos. One of the next things to consider when you're looking for great photos is light. Photography really is all about light. In fact, you look up the root of photography, and it's really about writing with light. It's about making images with light. So when it comes to light, there's a couple important things to consider: the direction of the light, the color of the light, and the intensity of the light. So here we've got an interesting case where this was on an oyster boat, waterman here. And you can see clearly that the light is actually behind him. And here I was using a light to bring some light in on my subject. Had I shot this without any supplemental light, of course, he would have been very dark and you wouldn't have been able to see him. So light can be really important in helping you to make a photo that you're looking for. So one of the first things to think about when it comes to light is the direction of light. Light can come from the side, it can come from behind, it can come from in front. And all of those things can give you different types of photographs. When you shoot people, you often can kind of manipulate the light and get different effects. If you bring up a light from behind, below someone, You kind of get this dark shadow and somebody might look evil. You can put a light off to the side and only illuminate half of someone's face. The point I want you to really to get here is that light is really important. And as you begin to look at photographs, look at the light, look at the shadows. Look at the photograph. Are you finding that there are areas in the photograph that are blown out, where there's been too much light and the photo just, kind of goes to white in certain areas? Really, more than being a master of light, it's being able to recognize good lighting and bad lighting and where lighting helps to tell a story. Light also, of course, comes with color. We talked about that in white balance a few minutes ago. But light carries with it different colors. Different times of the day, you'll find that light looks different. You often find, if you talk to photographers, they often go out and they shoot outside at sunrise or sunset, a little before sunrise, a little after sunset. They even have terms for this: the golden hour, the blue hour, the time when the light kind of changes and makes things more interesting. When you go out and you shoot something at high noon, the light's coming down from above and you get harsh shadows on your subject. And the light's not very appealing. It can often lead to blown out highlights. But when you're shooting, let's say at sunset, the light is passing through more atmosphere. It's getting more color to it. Tends to have a warmer tone to it at sunset. You'll find that the shadows become longer and more interesting. So people shoot at different times to get different light. Sunrise and sunset tend to produce a very warm light. Warm light can be very appealing when you're shooting pictures of people, because people usually look a little better warmed up in terms of the light rather than cooled down or blue like we saw in an example a few minutes ago. So the color of light can be really important in helping to determine what's a great photograph. So color is another factor that really influences what can make a great photo for light. And one of the other ones is intensity. Sometimes we want a scene to be very, very well lit. Other times we want to produce a silhouette, or we want something to be kind of in the shadows, or maybe we want something partially in the shadows. The amount of light can be really important to helping you tell a story as well. So, kind of the color, the direction, the intensity, all of those factors help to influence the light that ultimately helps to make the photograph and what can be a great photograph. So light is a really important factor. One of the next important factors, and probably one of the most important factors, is a great photo should evoke emotion. There's different things that we can think about. Does it tell a story? Does the photo ask a question? Is it fresh or unexpected? Does it really make you feel some kind of emotion or have an impact on you? All of those are signs that a photograph is going to be strong and successful. So again, great photos should help tell a story. You look at a photo like this and you can imagine kind of, he's out on the beach, he's hunting for shark's teeth. You look at the sky and you can see it's probably a little before sunset, maybe even sunrise. We've got long shadows there. You can kind of imagine the day that led up to this photograph. And I think a really good photo helps to tell a story. It helps to kind of put the viewer inside of what's happening. Sometimes a great photo asks a question, though. You look at a photograph and you wonder to yourself, what happened? How did this person end up in a situation? How did this boat end up, being half submerged? What was going on? Was there a hurricane? Was there a storm? Was there an accident? Stories, that lead to questions, and photographs that kind of prompt those questions can be really great ways to engage viewers. So a strong photo will often ask a question or make people wonder how things came to that point. Sometimes it's showing things that are unexpected. Fresh or unexpected. I've shot lots of photographs of lighthouses, really one of my favorite subjects, but here's one that's a little different. This is shot beneath the Drum Point Lighthouse. It was a wide-angle lens. I took the camera down nice and low, and it to me reminds me of like a landing craft coming down and landing on the moon, or some kind of some kind of spaceship. So something kind of unexpected, and that can make a photo that, while it may not be the strongest photo in the world, it can make it really interesting and help tell a different kind of story. Oftentimes we all go out to places and we take photos standing at the same height and we get the same photograph. One of the tips I often give in photography classes is change your perspective. Get down low, lay on the ground, get up high somewhere and shoot down. Find a way to shoot something from a different place and really make it kind of fresh and unexpected. Does it evoke emotion? Evoking emotion can be a really strong way to communicate things. So when it comes to communicating our data and our science, if we're evoking emotion, we're connecting with the viewer. Here's a shot of a bunch of kids getting ready to go on a ride, and if you look at the faces, they all look a little unsure and petrified. But again, you can feel the emotion. You can feel the emotion that they're experiencing at this point, and it helps to connect to a stronger photograph. So emotion is a very important aspect of what makes a great photograph. And making an impact, something that just, when you see it, you're like, wow. Oftentimes, whether it was been in photography classes or I've been involved with camera clubs as well, we do a process of critiques. And critiques are really important. Critiques are taking work and getting people's critical input and trying to make better products. And we should do that with all of our work, whether it's a publication or a data visualization. Getting input and trying to make better products is always important. But one of the things we talk about in critiques is really trying to provide valuable input. Oftentimes with a great photo, you get a response like, wow, oh, that's amazing. And that's really great. That means your photo has an impact. When it comes to critique, though, we often want people to go another step and say, why do they like it? Why is it amazing? What do they like about it? But the bottom line here is a photograph that makes an impact, that gets a reaction, a wow or amazing. That's a photograph that's a strong photo. That's going to resonate with your viewers when it comes to communicating your visualizations. So those are some of the elements of what makes a great photograph. It's about light. It's about technical factors. It's about evoking emotions. There's much more that we could go into. This is really just an introduction. But one of the next things I want to talk about is something called composition. Composition is really the kind of the placement or arrangement of things within your photograph. If we were to start with a blank canvas and begin painting something, our composition would be where we place things within that blank canvas. Where the subject was, where different elements were, where the light was coming from. So the composition is really about the arrangement of all the different things in a photograph. And photographs, of course, have compositions as well. Sometimes they're staged, sometimes they just happen to be a result of what you were capturing. But as a photographer, somebody has the ability to kind of get a unique composition and frame the shot the way they want to. As somebody looking for photographs, you have the ability to choose photographs that have strong compositional elements. So I want to talk about some of the compositional techniques. We're not going to go into great detail here, but I want you to be able to recognize them, because when you're looking for photographs, recognizing a good composition will help you find better photographs. There are a number of techniques I'll talk about here, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll talk about the rule of thirds, filling the frame, simplifying, patterns, leading lines. Again, all techniques of composition, but just the beginning of the techniques. If you have any background in photography or even art, you've no doubt heard of the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is basically taking three imaginary lines and or intersecting your lines at three places here and drawing out a grid over your photograph that breaks it into thirds. And basically the rule of thirds says place your important elements at those intersection points. So compositionally, here we can see the lighthouse happens at one of those intersection points. Placing subjects at the intersection points versus the middle of the photograph often, not always, but often make a stronger composition. So the rule of thirds is a very popular technique. You'll often find that people will take their subject and kind of put it off center. That holds true for things like horizons as well. Having the horizon 50-50 in the middle of the frame is often not the best place to put it. In my classes, I talk about picking a winner. What's happening? Is the sky more interesting? Is the foreground more interesting? Adjust your composition accordingly, and you often get a better composition. Another technique is to fill the frame. One of the mistakes that photographers often make when they get into photography is they start out way too far away from their subjects. And as a result, we have little tiny people in a giant frame, and they're not very compelling photographs. Whether you're shooting people or wildlife or flowers, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, filling the frame, really getting close to your subject, can make a much stronger photograph. And even if that's not the strongest photograph you take, the one that fills the frame, trying to vary your technique can really be helpful. One of the things that we talk about commonly in photography is getting close to your subject. And in the exercises that I often do with people, I tell them to get two steps closer and they take a shot. Get 2 more steps closer. There's a great zoom that you have with your feet. Your ability to walk closer to a subject in many cases can really get you a stronger photograph. Simplify. This was a picture taken as the sun was rising. It was in a boat shed. There were lots of boats hanging up kind of in the rafters around this boat. But in this particular case, I really wanted to isolate this one boat. And I did that by kind of where I was standing in relation to the other boats, the way the picture was exposed. But it ended up with one kind of simple photograph. And you can see the light coming in on the side of the boat. That was a very warm light that was coming in there. Really helped to kind of make an interesting composition. But often what makes a strong photograph is not what is in the photograph, but what's not in the photograph. By eliminating elements from a photograph, by making less distractions, you often get a better photograph. So simplifying can be a technique that can help make stronger photographs. Patterns is another compositional technique. Patterns tend to be really appealing to us as humans. We tend to see these patterns and they can be really interesting and intriguing. There are patterns all around us. Whenever I teach a photography class, I have an assignment where people begin to look for patterns. And it's amazing how you'll suddenly notice patterns that are all around you in a room that you would have never noticed had you not been looking for them. But patterns are another interesting compositional technique that kind of draw viewers in. With that comes things like leading lines, which can kind of lead users to a subject. Leading lines can be another fantastic way to kind of draw a user's attention to a certain subject. Again, these are just some compositional techniques. There are many, and we've just scratched the surface. But I hope in this segment you've learned a little bit about, what makes a great photograph. It's about light. It's about technical factors. It's about emotion. It's about composition. All of those things are things that you want to consider, whether you're looking for great photographs to use or you're making your own great photographs to use. Coming up next in the next segment, we're going to talk more about finding great photographs.